attention. You lost. Put it away. You lost. All right. Darren, please give your attention to Darren. All right, he's put this talk together. He wants to share it with you. Give him some respect. He's our what do you do? You know him as our tube meister.
So the question I have to ask everybody before I start this is, what happens when you come unprepared to give a presentation and you forget to bring a laser pointer?
That happens to me every day in class.
And the equipment doesn't work.
Well, you can be creative, and I did. I decided that I had a perfectly good pointer on the front of my truck, so I just So what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about post-war record changers.
Which war?
Generally, the one that's about to begin, if you don't mind yourself. Basically, I'm going to go into the more common types of record changers that were used in the post-war period, but basically up through the late 60s. When you talk about record changers in the United States, believe it or not, you're not necessarily talking about that many different machines, because the majority of them were made by a small number of manufacturers, generally American and British. And that's what we're going to get into. So we're going to start, and we're going to go basically nearly from the introduction of the phonograph record. Manufacturers of playback devices have attempted to come up with ingenious methods of automating the playback of records. From the earliest mechanical record repeaters, which were little sheet metal plates that would spin around on the Victrolas and bring the arm back to the beginning of the record. We're going to focus primarily on post-war mechanical record changers. Basically, we're not going to go into the vacuum-powered Lincoln changers or the K-part drive from before the war. We're going to talk about the different types and what really the main failure points on them. And I'm going to try to point out what the pitfalls are and what the critical areas are when you go to restore them. Over the years, there are many methods of going to changing the records. We'll go over some of the more popular of these methods. The first would be the knife edge changers. This really started before the war, and they were some of the first changers made after the war. Basically, and I don't have a picture, but Marty Friedman was nice enough to bring one tonight. Knife edge changers are identifiable because they have multiple posts around the outside of the record. And these would swing in and the records would sit on them. And basically there's a little blade that comes out over here and stops one record from falling. The problem was the sizing on 78s was really not standard, nor was the thickness. So what invariably used to happen are these changers would chip and crack the edges of the records. They were not really effective, and record damage was really common. Generally, they were 78 only, and as I said, they were breaking records. Perhaps the most popular changers built in the 1950s were the RCA 45 changers. They were inexpensive. They were very well marketed by RCA, and many of them are still around. Many people have childhood memories of them, and for this and many other reasons, they have really become collectible. The 45 changers, in actuality, are something of modified knife edge design. The difference is the blades are contained in the spindle, and the 45 records are a lot more standardized in their thickness and hole size than the 78s were in thickness and diameter. Even at that, there are problems. Occasionally you'll find a record that's either too thick or the hole is too tight to function on the 45 EY changers. They're generally not very difficult to rebuild, and once they're rebuilt properly, they do perform relatively well. There's a picture of a typical RCA 45 changer. Consequently, the mechanism employed in the spindle of this changer and the principle by how the records are dropped is pretty standard for most of the slide-on spindles that go on the other changers as well. The other and most common changer were the pusher platform changers. And what those changers have is there is a sliding finger on the center post of the changer that pushes the record, which rests on its center hole, off the ledge, and it goes sliding down the spindle. On the top is a little wedge that drops out and prevents the rest of the stack from following it. It's the most reliable of all drop methods and was used by a majority of the manufacturers. It was created in England by Garrard, and Garrard initially didn't use a pusher in the spindle. They used one on the outer edge of the record, moving it to the spindle in later years. Then finally we have umbrella spindle changers. They're a lot less common and became more popular in later years. They're more complex, and they were primarily used by the Germans and later on in the 70s and 80s by the Japanese. They are the most gentle of all changing mechanisms. The records don't slide against each other. You find them on Perpetuum Ebner Dual and other German use, as well as on the Garrard Lab 80, which is the only Garrard actually of the post-war period to not use the pusher platform and later Technics. Now, some changers are known to be more reliable in the case of VM, RCA, and Calaro. And some may even be said to be bulletproof, which in my opinion would describe certain Garrard and certain VM changers. Certain changers, however, should be avoided at all costs, and that will bring us to WebCore. Popular brands, like television tuners of the time, record changers were made by a small number of manufacturers. Usually, radio and TV companies purchased rebranded changers from the changer manufacturers rather than engineer and build their own. This makes servicing a little simpler since there are not that many different designs. By far, the VM changers were the most commonly rebranded that you will find. And so we will start with the specifics of VM changers. They are the most common changer. They're used in a majority of the packaged radio and hi-fi consoles from 1946 well into the 1970s. They're very simple and reliable mechanically, and there is nearly total parts availability from VM in Benton Harbor, Michigan. The entire inventory of the VM plant was salvaged before the plant was torn down. And there's a gentleman by the name of Gary Stork on the internet who actually has all VM parts you're ever going to need. They're very standardized from model to model, regardless of the trim and cosmetics. The mechanics are, there's really basically 3 different VM designs, and they're very standardized. The only bad thing about them is they're somewhat less gentle and a little more clumsy than others, so they're harder on your records. But then again, they're not really high-end changers. There's a picture of a typical 1950s VM changer. If you look up here on this plate, which actually shows absolutely nothing, if the manufacturer is a larger manufacturer, they would have had their name molded into here. A VM sold as a VM said Voice and Music on here. Emerson changers said Emerson on here. Many manufacturers had their names molded into here. You'll notice the 2 knobs, the speed change and the actuator are here. This is very standard of VM. Sometimes you'll see levers, but they'll generally be in these corners. And this shape of the spindle post is a telltale sign you're looking at a VM changer. This one's a little unusual because it has a GE variable reluctance cartridge in there, early magnetic cartridge. Usually these had ceramics. This was a higher end offering, which means it has a 4-pole motor as well. And then we get to WebCore. Unfortunately, they were second behind VM in popularity. And a fair number of manufacturers used them, however, As you get on into the later 50s and early 60s, you will see web core changers fade from packaged units, and my belief is because manufacturers probably had a lot of callbacks on them because they were never reliable even when they were new. They are very unreliable. Parts availability is nil. Webcore went bankrupt in 1968. I have good reason to suspect why. Their Magic Mind models are particularly erratic, even when they operate properly. I do not recommend them for a first-time rebuild because you will go insane. There's a typical Webcore. They did make a few of them in chrome. They're kind of cool looking. And once again, unusually, this one has also has a GE cartridge in it. BSR. Now we get into the least expensive and most common of the British changers. I've always found it interesting that throughout history, especially in the days when America made most of what America bought, there were certain products that were known to come from certain countries. Watches from Switzerland, sports cars from England, machinery lathes used to come from England. The British developed quite a reputation for building good record changers. And BSR was their basically least expensive line.
Is that a Webcore laptop?
Yeah.
That's a HP on it?
Yeah.
Don't stick your pointer in there, stick your power.
I'm glad you can mind over the air instruction.
Let's go and plug that thing that says don't unplug.
Is there?
We either have that.
Smoke gas.
Bingo.
Difficulties.
So the BSRs are nearly as common as web cores. They're very reliable when they're restored. They're the least expensive of the British changers. Rebuild is fairly simple. Parts are available only from salvaged units because there are no NOS parts, which actually there are some available from South Street Service out of Long Island. As with VM, they are simple and they're not very delicate. There's a typical bare bones BSR changer from the 60s. Once again, they're generally recognizable by these flat outer ring controls. And they always have this little plastic feeler arm on the back. That's what senses the diameter of the disc when it drops.
BSR means what?
We have a lot of things we call them, but I later found out it means Birmingham Sound Reproducers. Yeah. Now we move up a step in the hierarchy of British society. We get to the Calaro changer, which in the United States saw the widest marketing under the Magnavox name. Magnavox, after about 1955, used Calaro exclusively, and with good reason. They're very dependable. They use a unique dual idler wheel system. Their performance is really nice, and I think they're a little more delicate in operation than the VM. But they do require 2 idler wheels to be rebuilt if the idler wheels are worn. There's a very typical 1960s Magnavox Calaro. This was a better model. This is the Imperial Micromatic. Basically meant they put a little more trim on it. And that brings us to Garrard. Garrard are generally very reliable changers. They were OEM in a lot of the better equipment back in the 60s. GE was putting them in a lot of their consoles in the later 50s into the 60s. Clairtone, there were a lot of other companies that used Garrard changers. The parts availability is once again nearly 100%. The entire stock of Garrard parts from Westbury wound up with South Street Service out in Southold, New York. They are very smooth operating. The only thing is, if you work on them, the different models, the design varied drastically because they were a changer manufacturer and they were constantly trying to improve their product.
Darren,
Yeah.
were you getting kind of sleepy when you were doing these bullets? Availability and operation?
Yeah, probably. So, so the Garage are a little more complex to work with. This is a typical 1960s Garage in a GE console. This is a low-end Garage, but it's better than most comparable to a VM. So here are going to be your preliminary checks when you start working on a changer. You're going to turn it over. You're going to look for bent parts or obviously misshapen parts. They'll need to be straightened, and sometimes you're going to have to find another unit to compare them to. You're going to check for frozen or totally stuck moving parts. It's really common. And my recommendation is to slowly try to move them, because the last thing you want to do is try to force a frozen arm or something, because that's how they get bent, and pot metal gears get stripped, and irreversible damage gets done. You want to check to see that the motor spins freely by hand. You want to check old wiring in the switch for signs of fraying or cracking, just for safety reasons. And you want to look at the stylus and the cartridge to make sure that they're still intact and the stylus isn't missing. The #1 cause of malfunction in record changers, particularly 40 years later, is hard grease. I can't stress this enough. The lubricants used when these things were new were of poor quality and frequently were becoming hard within 5 years. There's someone in this room, I think, who could vouch for that. So all that hard grease has to be removed, or you can't expect any kind of reliability out of the changer. This is a picture I took underneath a Calero that I happen to have around. If you look over here on this sliding plate, you'll see all of this yellow stuff. This is grease that literally is rock hard to the touch. It has to be chemically dissolved to get it off. Otherwise, it prevents this arm from moving back and forth. This is the actuator that operates the spindle on the changer.
What do you use to get the grease on?
Can I get to that?
I'll get to that.
Good.
Okay. When dealing with record changers, cleaning is a better part of the rebuild. Disassembly is sometimes necessary, however, sometimes cleaning may be done with the parts in place. The hard grease, dust, and dry oil has to be removed with a suitable cleaner. Naphtha-based lighter fluid and lacquer thinner are the preferred solvents now. When I started doing this 15 years ago, we were still able to get trichloroethane and carbon tet, which worked even better, but can't get them anymore. Avoid stuff like Simple Green and other environmentally whatever degreasers, because they tend to be more trouble than they're worth because they are water-based. So here are some basic tools that you're going to need. You see I have lighter fluid here because this is probably one of the best solvents to use. As for lubricants, we have dry graphite, and this is Moly Lube. White lithium grease lubriplate is also really good. Mica dust, if you can get it. Any of those lubricants are good. This is an internal-external retaining ring, True Art ring remover. You're going to need one on certain machines. A pair of tweezers is good to have. Phillips and flat blade screwdrivers. You're going to need a set of Allen wrenches. This is a little probe to hook onto springs and stuff like that. Needle nose pliers are a must, and I recommend a 90-degree set. This is a stylus scale, which is not necessary, but it's a nice thing to have. And over here we have, this is an E-clip applicator tool, which is not necessary, but it makes things a hell of a lot easier. The trouble is they're very hard to find.
But they look so neat in the toolbox.
Yeah, my father worked for Waldy's back in the 60s, which is how I wound up, he had that. I wound up with it for him.
It's ordered from IBM all the time.
Yeah. And Bristol wrenches, right?
Bristol wrenches, yeah, still have that.
So here's a few do's and don'ts. Do keep track of your part removal. There are many small parts that can suddenly pop out and go flying.
Do you take pictures of, before you disassemble anything?
If I'm not familiar with the machine or I don't have a service manual,
With the digital cameras,
it makes things easier, yeah. Do clean all the parts thoroughly with a good solvent. Don't use WD-40 liquid wrench or any other penetrating oil to fix a record changer. Many, many times I've seen people take WD-40 and saturate the bottom of a changer mechanism and become extremely happy when the changer starts working 10 minutes later. All you're doing is loosening the hard grease. WD-40 is a kerosene-based, and actually most penetrating oils contain kerosene, which is going to dry, and the hard grease has now been carried into places where it was never supposed to be in the first place, and you've made a bad situation even worse. The WD-40 consequently is not and never was intended to be a lubricant. It was actually designed as a rust inhibitor, and in later years became, they found a lot of uses for it, but it really isn't a lubricant.
It's water displacement.
Yeah. Don't use wheel bearing grease or any other long fiber grease on record changers. These greases are made to function at high temperatures. They're great for roller bearings on your wheels, but at room temperature they're way too thick, and they're actually going to slog down the mechanism.
What do you mean by long fiber grease?
Grease used on automobile wheel bearings contains asbestos fibers, or I don't know what they're putting in it now.
Not all of them.
What?
Depends on the.
The long fiber grease has fibers in it to help keep it in place and keep it from running when it gets hot.
Not all wheel bearing greases have that.
No, but I'm saying the long fiber grease has.
Yeah.
Yes. Do use dry lubricants such as graphite, moly, mica, etc., as well as high-quality lithium greases such as Lubricate. Do use the lubricant sparingly, as excess lube can cause many problems.
Tell them where they can get Lubricate.
But
Tell them where they can buy Lubricate.
any auto parts store generally has it. You can order it from companies like MSC. It's readily available. Don't use spray grease because it winds up where it's not supposed to be, and that becomes another problem. So now we get to idler wheels. Here's a sort of a little selection of various idler wheels. This is a turret. Problem with idler wheels is they tend to get hard. The ozone in the air reacts with the rubber, and it either glazes over or becomes completely rock solid. They come in all sizes. They shouldn't say shapes because they're all round. Kind of. You get into an RCA 45 changer, they're not round. They are one of the most common failure items in the changers. They have not been manufactured in more than 20 years. They can all be sent out for rebuilding, and sometimes they can be rejuvenated. Attempting to rejuvenate an idler wheel, the first thing you want to do is make sure that the rubber is at least somewhat supple. Cracked, or if the thing is rock hard, you can forget it. It has to be stripped and rebuilt.
Darren,
Yeah.
can you recommend somebody that'll redo
Yes.
an idler wheel?
Yes. If a wheel has a hard coating or it's glazed, it may well be salvageable. The first thing is you're going to put the idler wheel, if you feel it might be salvageable, and you can't lose by doing this, you put it in a lathe or a drill chuck. While spinning the wheel at about 300 to 500 RPM, you gently hold a piece of black emery paper to the surface of the wheel. This is simply to break the glaze that forms on the surface of that wheel. Once you have finished with the emery, clean the face of the idler with lacquer thinner. Now check the wheel for traction and supple feel. The way that this should work is if you take the wheel in your hand, set it down on a flat surface, and you drag it with slight pressure, you should feel the wheel grab the surface. If the wheel just slides along the surface, the wheel ain't going to drive a changer. Here's an example of a wheel that is absolutely not a candidate for rejuvenation. As you can see, it has cracks in the surface of the wheel. It's hard as a rock, through and through. Now we're going to get to retaining rings. Retaining rings are these little clips, which I'll show you. You'll see one in a second. They hold items on shafts. They have earned many colorful names over the years due to their spontaneous nature. With a little care and the right tools and techniques, they can be handled with minimal chance of flight.
We had little C-clips on Fire Fridays, and we used to call them Jesus.
That's, as I said, I didn't want to bring up the names, but there's a whole laundry list of them. And, I know somebody that wound up with one firmly planted in their cornea.
Ooh.
Yeah.
A small flat blade screwdriver is the best method for removal while holding the ring with a needle nose plier, if you can get it in there. A ring applicator is handy to put them back on, but in its absence, you may use a pair of needle nose pliers to squeeze the ring or the shaft. Here's a picture of a screwdriver being used to remove an E-clip. These are called E-clips because they have 3 points, and they kind of resemble the letter E when they're not on the shaft. What do we see over here? What do we see all over here? More hard grease. And this is how you put the E-clip back on using the actual applicator that was made for the purpose. They are still made, and I see them on eBay from time to time. They came in all different sizes. Really, if you're going to do a lot of them, it makes life a whole lot easier.
There also a variation of that you can use to turn or push off the clip as well.
Not for these clips. They're slightly for the larger clips.
Yeah, I know I've seen something for that, but I wouldn't.
Now, once you get it back together, you want to check the speed. The simplest way to do that is with a strobe disc. You're always going to make certain that you're using a strobe disc intended for 60 cycles per second. There seem to be a lot of 50-cycle strobe discs floating around, I assume because they were for worldwide market changers. And believe it or not, I knew someone who didn't understand why the strobe disc wouldn't work in the sunlight coming in from the window. What I had to explain is that the sun is not synchronized at 60 cycles because the Europeans just wouldn't have it.
The sun's metric back.
Yeah, it is. If the unit is running on speed, the dots on a strobe disc will appear to stand still. Here's an example of a strobe disc. The larger the dots, the higher the speed. Is your 78, 33, 78, 45, 33 and a third. And as you can see, it clearly says in most will, 60 cycle lamp.
So you can use an incandescent lamp B, that's like a fluorescent.
No, you can use incandescent.
Incandescent?
Sure, absolutely. Fluorescent is easier to view, or neon.
Incandescent?
Yeah, it'll work under incandescent. As long as it's a 60 cycle lamp.
Yeah.
When we get to motors, now this comes after speed tests because very frequently that's when you'll notice that your motor needs to be rebuilt. When you check a changer for speed and you find it to be slow, this is an telltale sign of hard lubrication in the motor. The only cure for this is disassembly and cleaning. The motor should spin freely with 2 fingers and continue to rotate for a few revolutions after you spin it by hand. If the motor comes to an abrupt stop after being spun, it's in need of cleaning and relube. So you take your fingers just like that, you hold the motor shaft, and you give it a spin. If the motor spins freely, the motor doesn't need to be taken apart. If the motor kind of comes to a stop after you let it go, you're going to have to take that motor apart, take a Q-tip into those bronze bearings in there, and clean them out with lighter fluid, put fresh oil in there.
That's if there's anything left.
That's if there's anything left. That's true. If the changer has been cleaned and degreased and it's running slow, the motor trouble is suspected. This is especially true if you find the unit runs on speed once it's warmed up. Because if the motors do get hot, and if the oil in the motor is old and hard, the heat from the motor will soften it up and make it fluid again, and it'll run when it's hot. And that means you got some hard oil in there. When you relube the motor, use a very small amount of fine oil for the relube. 3-in-1 turbine oil, they call it, spindle oil or lily white sewing machine oil are all fine. Don't put automobile engine oil in there.
I had trouble using that 3-in-1 oil and sewing machine oil in a motor years ago. It just, after it got hot, it would bind up again. I finally used watch oil and I had no more trouble with it.
Watch oil.
Watch oil.
Watch oil is very expensive.
3-in-1 evaporates.
Yeah, that's called fulcrum oil. Fulcrum oil, very expensive. But,
You can get it from Clock Kit.
yeah.
They sell it, and it's not terribly expensive.
Trying to stay.
And mine lasted 10 years in that container.
Yeah,
great.
You don't want too much oil in there. That's not a good thing. After you reassemble the motor, you're going to take a soft-faced hammer, a dead blow hammer, a rubber mallet, handle of a big screwdriver, and give the motor a good rap on the side, top of the shaft, and the bottom of the motor. This is to set the bronze bearings square to the shaft. If you don't, you may find after you've assembled it, the motor binds. Most of those bearings are actually they're bronze sleeve bearings, oilite. They hold the oil. And also, when you're in there, a lot of times you'll see a felt ring around that bearing. If there is a felt ring, that's called packing. And that's where you put the oil. The felt holds the oil. And the oilite bearing, which is actually made of something called sintered bronze, is going to absorb that oil and pass it through to the inside of the bearing. So the other thing I was going to say is that you should avoid making the changer work better by bending parts of the mechanism. This is something that people do, saying, oh, well, it's just the arm just isn't going where it's supposed to go. I'm going to bend this and then it will. Lo and behold, you find that it doesn't trip right at the end of the record. Machines were made with the parts of a certain size for a reason, and this will almost always cause another aspect of the change cycle to function incorrectly. Don't turn the platter of a changer backwards while the machine is engaged in cycle. Although it won't harm most changers, some models can sustain serious damage from being turned backwards, especially certain garage. And now it's time to enjoy it. You have preserved a piece of American history, and you hopefully get many hours of listening and enjoyment from the chamber. And now it's time for me to answer your questions, which I know there will probably be one, maybe two.
Hey, with the web core, the ones that were really erratic,
yeah.
What was the reasoning for that? Were the parts poorly manufactured? Was the actual engineering design there?
Horrendous design, too many moving parts, and very poor quality control. And that company in the early days was one of the powerhouses in the tape recorder and record changer business. As the 50s wore on, they suffered. They became more about corporate embezzling and mismanagement, and the product went the way of the Edsel. Yeah.
I was going to ask Columbia changer. What do you think that one's probably got?
BSR generally.
BSR?
Generally BSR.
So,
what vintage?
I think it's probably 1960s. It was actually my grandparents.
Generally BSR. Unless it was one of the higher end Columbias, it may have been a garage.
Is there any USA?
Are you sure it wasn't a VM?
Some of them were VM.
Because
by
the
60
Columbia I just got off you, that's a VM.
Yeah. Yeah, they kind of used a bunch because Columbia was sourcing stuff from all over. They had whole units that were made in England. So it depends on which unit it is.
Yeah, it's 1960s. Probably it was my grandparents.
Yeah, it's probably
It
either
just came out slowly.
VM or VSR.
How can you tell?
What?
How can you tell whether it's a VM or a...
Well, that was kind of why. Let me go back to the pictures and I'll tell you. You know, if you look.
These changes, right? Yeah.
Okay, this is a BSR. Okay, if you look now, the real telltale of a BSR is this little arm back here. The arm sticks out, and the arm is horizontal, and it sticks out. It's a little plastic finger. What that tells the machine how big the record is and where to place the arm when it changes. If you look at a VM, and my picture of the VM here, you're not going to see it. It actually has a little metal arm that sticks up with a triangular shaped barb on the top of it that sticks straight up. That's one way to tell the knobs. I mean, once you've seen a fair number of them, you look on the internet, look up VM changer in Google Images, and then look up BSR changer. You'll know immediately because you'll be able to tell. VM changers also have a long number stamped on the bottom of the chassis, and the BSRs do not. And somewhere on the BSR it's going to say made in England. Yeah.
These are the most common ones. How many other ones would you say are out there?
Well, Admiral made their own changer.
Motorola.
Motorola generally used VM. There was one called the Glenberg later on. That's real garbage. Hold on, who else made changers?
What about Webster Chicago?
Webster Chicago's Webcore.
Fisher.
Fisher generally used either BSR, Perpetuum Ebner, Dual, sometimes Gerard. The early Fishers were all Gerard.
How about silver tongue?
Sears used the Crescent and one of their own changers, but in later years they were using, I think, VM. There were a few oddballs in there. GE for a while made their own. RCA made their own, the RCA was very similar to a VM design, but it was made by RCA. And I think it may have been designed by Carson, who designed the 45 changer.
I think Carson ripped it off from VM.
Yeah, it's really similar to a VM. The parts aren't really the same, but the function is, it has the same slider mechanism like a VM. Yeah.
You mentioned something earlier about, checking the speed of the
No,
stroke.
That's their
Is there a way to adjust any of these early changes for
Right.
speed?
No,
So why not?
no, they are locked. It's a synchronous motor. It's locked to the AC line, and they're not all that accurate, especially not the two-pole stuff. And they are what they are. And sometimes when those motors do develop problems, winding short, they'll run hot and they'll run off speed. Sometimes they're shaded pole motors. Sometimes the shading coils develop problems and they'll run off speed.
Your only alternative is to find another motor.
Yeah, there really is no way to repair those
There's no way to
motors.
shunt the motor with some variable resistance or something?
No, because the speed is not governed by voltage. The speed is governed by frequency.
Well, you can actually change the cycle on the motor.
Well, you can change the pulley on a motor. I mean, you could remachine the step pulley if you wanted to get into it to vary the speed, but you're talking a lot of work there. It's easier just to find an extra motor. Yeah.
As far as collectability and people calling for repairing these things, now I'm just familiar with the ones that are in the console, and the vintage you're talking about. You don't see many people trying to restore those consoles with those types of players in it. Although
Plenty of
sold individually, I could see it.
they were as well. Well, remember, a lot of these were also found in portable cases.
But then again, if somebody had a good record collection, and
You would be amazed at how many people want to restore the changer in a 50s or 60s console, especially
Really?
now. Yeah. Yeah, especially Magnavox consoles from the 60s are bringing a few $100 now on eBay sometimes.
Really?
People want them, yeah.
Why
Yeah.
do you want? I mean, it
I
also kills
I
the-
don't know. I would find them on a weekly basis in the garbage, but
All the TV programs
What
out there
won't
now
it kill the
are
record though?
50s and
Also,
60s.
I mean, there's no way.
they're selling
They're
they're selling fewer and fewer CDs every year. Does anybody know what they're selling more and more of every
I
year?
know.
Oh, I do.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, if you want to preserve the record, wouldn't you want like a good duel or
Yes. Yeah, but that doesn't. Common sense doesn't always reign.
Do you get much call for redoing these?
Yes, I had a friend who passed away whose business was rebuilding record changers. He was doing 6 figures a year, doing nothing but rebuilding record changers 3 years ago.
Really?
Yeah.
That's why I passed along.
I've sometimes, not always, had good luck with the purple idler restorer. What's your experience with that?
If you can't fix them by sanding them down and cleaning them up with lacquer thinner, they can't be fixed. because that's literally taking off the bad material. If the wheel is too hard to grip by itself, the wheel is too hard to give and grip and drive a changer for any amount of time. And the rubber needs to be replaced. I have found that those things just don't last.
They get flat spots on them?
Most of the better changers, the wheel was pulled back when you put the thing into neutral. The RCA 45 players get flat spots. Some other changers get flat spots.
Where do you get the new rubber wheels and stuff from?
There is one rebuilder that I recommend to everybody. There are several on the internet. I only recommend one. His name is Ed Crockett. He's in Mississippi. His service, his wheels are as good as if you bought them brand new, if not better. His precision is superb, and his wheels work every time.
In other words, he makes them himself then, he manufactures
Well,
them.
what the process is you put the wheel in a lathe, you turn off the old rubber, and you either remold new rubber and then remachine the outside, or you use an O-ring and cement it on and they remachine the outside. But he's very selective about his rubber. He was involved with Russell Industries and EV Game back when EV Game was making wheels. And he's been in this since the 50s, so he knows what he's doing. And like I said, I've dealt with the other ones and I've seen horrible wheels.
Well, what's your experience with West Tech Services then?
Not good.
Not good?
Not awful. Not good. Let me say not always not good.
I've been lucky
Erratic.
then. I've been lucky then.
Unpredictable.
Who was that?
West Tech,
Services.
yeah.
What about the guy in Collingswood, New Jersey? He advertises in Antique Radio Classified. He
The
says-
old one?
Yeah.
He does, like the speakers.
Yeah,
Yeah, he
the
does
speakers
speakers,
are
too.
good. The speakers are real good. He's around the corner from him.
Yeah, I don't know about wheels. Yeah.
I was actually gonna throw a monkey wrench in and ask you, what about Bob Punk and Grundig? What did they make their own?
No, they usually, it depends on the machine. Some of them use dual, some of them use Telefunken changers, some of them use PE Rex.
So I mean, would that be considered a good one, or like a VM or a?
They're German changers, they're a little more flaky, but they're not horrendous. They're not as good as the American and the British.
What about anti-slip gun?
Don't use it.
It makes
Don't
a
use it.
mess.
It makes a mess. You know what it winds up doing when you put that on the inside of the platter underneath? It gets hard, and the inside of the platter is no longer smooth and flat. So now the idler wheel is running along the inside of the platter like a tire on a New Jersey road, bouncing up and down. And now you're introducing more wow and flutter than the thing had when it was new.
Go ahead, let him go.
Yeah, what's up?
You think the members might be interested in a copy of that? I mean, not everybody, but you're able to print that out?
Print it on the website, no?
Print your presentation?
Yeah, I guess I could do that if somebody
Well,
needs a
unless
copy.
you get
No, that's
a
fine.
copyrighted.
Just send it up to Dave,
And
we'll
maybe we
post it
can
on the
either put
web.
it-
Well, Dave has a copy of it, so you can go to the website.
Yeah, so why don't we put it on the website for anybody that wants it?
That's fine.
If it's on the website though, can you print it out from the website?
Yeah, that's fine. I don't care. Anybody can have it. Yeah.
Can we sell it on eBay?
Does RCA sell theirs exclusively, the changes under RCA name, and not supply anybody else?
They only were sold under the RCA name, generally in consoles, but I have found RCA changers sold as components doing the boxes. So apparently they were trying to market record changers at one point.
Just curious, you said that they branded other names in that blank plate on those. Why is that one blank if they sold them on their own?
Because this is a small independent manufacturer's little hi-fi phonograph that I found. Is a low production item. I don't think it was a high margin company.
Okay.
And I just don't think they wanted to spend the money to have VM. But because basically what that would have involved, if you know anything about injection molding, is you would have had to machine a mold with that name in the mold. And I can tell you that making molds is a lot of work.
Would they have possibly used a decal or an applique on it?
Nah, it was generally, it reverse painted into that plastic with those VMs. Yeah.
The Eclipse are available at, again, Pep Boys or any of these.
The Eclipse.
The Eclipse, yeah.
Oh, yeah, Eclipse.
Yeah, well, you think of it as a car part for a car.
Yeah,
Because that's what they were used for.
They're available from hardware stores, auto parts stores, they're pretty readily available. Yeah,
Yeah, VM is very easy to identify between the index lever and the outer part of the turntable. There's a 10-inch index lever with a rubber bumper on it.
Right.
And it comes up
Yeah.
during the cycle. If you clue in on that, that's the VM. The other one is the garage is very easy to tell because they have an iridite coating of all their mechanical parts underneath. It's sort of a yellowish, light greenish tinge. And
Don't scrape it off, it's not grease?
oh no,
no, it prevents rust, it's really good
actually.
actually.
Fungus, that's work in Alaska and it'll
Yeah.
work in the
Yeah, they're-
Mojave Desert.
Oh.
Yeah, they're good. Yeah.
There was another thing that you were talking about, stroboscopes.
Yeah.
The garage changer, most of the older ones,
Yeah.
that have a rubber ground mat.
Right.
The outside of that mat has square serrations.
Yeah.
And if you hold the 60 cycle neon bulb or the lamp there, it will stand still on 33.
There was also a record, I forget what it was, there was a label of record that had dots around the outside that were locked to the speed, I forget what it was, but, yeah.
Cartridges and needles and stuff. Now,
Yeah.
there's a guy, I can't remember what website it is, but you go to him, I don't know, I'll see if you had any experience with him. He claims that he has just about everything that's needed. I mean, is it?
There are a lot of people in the needle business today. And actually, there are companies still making certain styli. The Swiss are in that business. And any of the styli you're getting today are generally coming out of Switzerland. And I generally was dealing with Ed Saunders. But there's a lot of guys doing styli and cartridges.
Well, I'm sorry, Darren, for these changes of this period, what were the type of cartridges used?
Once again, normally they were crystalline ceramic in most of the cheaper ones, but as you see here, this was a little kind of a specialty unit. This has that GE VR, which is an early magnetic, as did that Webcord. The magnetics you don't see a lot of, you see them in the higher end units. You can see that in one of your better Fisher, some Motorola's, some actually, believe it or not, some Webcors, certain GEs, some of your really high-end consoles.
That one's got a dust brush on it.
BIC, was BIC considered pretty decent?
BIC, you want to know what BIC was? BIC was in St. Joseph, Michigan. When basically BIC is British Industries Corporation. That was started by a fellow by the name of Cardooner on Long Island. They were in Westbury. Their original business was importing Garrard record changers, Wharfdale speakers, Urson solder, and Genelex tubes. All British products marketed in the United States. They made nothing. Garrard, one by one, they lost all these franchises because these companies realized they didn't need the importer. When their names became known, they all started their own American subsidiaries to market their products. So BIC was left without a line to sell. So what they did was they decided to make their own record changer in the United States in St. Joseph, Michigan, which is surprisingly close to Benton Harbor, Michigan. So basically what you have is a VM manufactured product. It's basically built by VM people. It was designed by VM engineers. And it's a good changer. It's from the 70s, early 80s. It's a good changer. They have a very big hard grease problem. The only time I've ever had to take a torch to get a platter off a changer. and you do. You got to heat up the center spindle. Otherwise, you're not getting that platter off half the time.
Jim Barron,
Yeah.
how would you figure out what kind of cartridge to use when you're going to feed a signal into the back of, say, a radio amplifier?
Well, okay. It really depends on the level of the output of the cartridge. Ceramics and crystals had higher output. Magnetics require an extra stage because their output is really low. If you're going into most AC/DC chassis is going to take a ceramic. There just isn't going to be the amplification level through a magnetic. If it's a higher end unit that had a magnetic or VR, you could replace it with a magnetic. But,
so So one way would, if you had a ceramic, or say you had a magnetic one, you fit it in, and you didn't get very much output, then you would know you had to go to the
Yeah.
ceramic. Basically, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Isn't a VR cartridge kind of a hot item today?
Yeah. Any of the old magnetics are hot items today. Yeah. As a matter of fact, I'll show you a picture of a stereo VR that I just pulled out of a console in the trash that just went for $125 on eBay.
Just the cartridge?
Just the cartridge. Yeah.
There, you didn't talk about adjusting or anything like that. Is that
Adjusting.
information readily available? I mean, I assume that you.
Well, yeah,
reference
I mean,
screws for
a lot of
RC
this,
and stuff like that.
well, this is all specific to the individual changes.
Right, is that information available?
Yeah, if you want to know about record changers, if you're doing this the first time, by all means, Sam's record changer manuals. Sam's published manuals, and remember, since VM changers are VM changers, if you can't find the manual for the model you have, just find one for a similar VM, a similar Garrard, dare I say a similar web core, you know.
Right.
That's the, yeah.
I don't know if anybody realized that, but Heath did back in the day.
Laser steers.
Yeah, I think they use Gerards, because I have a manual at home, and you look, I mean, it's exactly
You know
like a
something?
Gerard.
There was, in the 50s, there was a Garrard Crest. They used the Crest, the single play, and I think there may have been like an RC series something, Garrard on the Heathkit.
Yeah.
But when Heathkit really was pushing record changers, they used Glazer steers. There's another one. Glazer steers is another anomaly. Made in New Jersey, by the way. The only changer that stopped completely during cycle. The platter would stop, the record would drop, and the platter would start again. They're not really common, they're kind of collectible, and yeah, there was another company that used them in their consoles. I don't remember if it was Motorola, somebody used them, I can't remember who it was, but not you don't see very many.
What's that called? Record cut? Was it?
Reco Cut is a single play.
Like the DJ,
That's a turn. Reco Cut, it's a single play turntable, yeah. Yeah, much higher end stuff.
Another camera floating around here somewhere.
Any other questions?
I guess we're done. I'm running out of.
Wonderful job, as usual. You're a man with a lot of information.
It was interesting. Different.
Just that I have to hire a new one.
Okay. Again, we want to thank Darren for his presentation.
Well, Darren, you neglected to say that Ed Crocker does not have a website.
Yes, he does.
Oh, he does?
Hold on a second. Let me see.
That's new then. When I dealt with him, he didn't have a website.
There used to be a lever, and the lever would flip back and forth.
By the way, can I do
When the lever, when the lever was in
John,
33, it was,
what was the worst record changer back in those days?
the worst one was the one you said. Oh, Philco was.
Oh, well, other than, but really,
That was a
Webcore,
very, very close.
am I exaggerating with Webcore?
No, the magic mind of the bullet, and they would have fixed. And you know, you have to argue with you about Garage, not Garage, but Calero.
Yeah.
They used to rumble, and they were always and they were
That's
expensive
pre-war.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were expensive.
Yeah.
Oh,
I don't need it anymore.
the older German record changes were horrible too.
Oh,
It wasn't too well.
This is the fellow who redoes the idler wheels. This is his website.
Free press. Jesus.
Yeah, this is the fellow who I recommend, and I really wouldn't recommend anybody else because his wheels are that good.
Married to a famous press?
All right, again, thanks so much, Darren, and we really appreciate the presentation. So we look forward to more. Like more. Yeah. Okay, let's all remember that our next meeting is here, our summer meetings are here. Okay, guys, our summer meetings are here at Princeton for obvious reasons of traffic, which was very heavy this evening. And our next Tech Talk will be Al Clay's in July here on ABC. We'll be telling us about ABC, so stay tuned. All right, let's remove ourselves for the auction. Again, this is the Allen Wright collection.
That's the one metal one. Only Webber speaker
Hey, Dick. Dick.
Yeah, well, I used to be curious. So I'm just using this little digital camera over here.
It's in a little plastic bottle. You get about 2 or 3 ounces.
Oh, really?
It's a good company. K-L-O-C-K-I-T. And I buy stuff from them constantly because I've restored several antique clocks. I use the oil for other stuff. It's an artificial oil. It's not based on whale oil or something. Wish I could type. Nice.
Like holding my phone.
Well, if you actually, I'll tell you.
No, K-L-O-C.
Like that.
These don't
K-L-O-C-K-I-T.
This one I read. These are all self-contained. This one here has sometimes has a slot. You can go there for it. So you can put a big card in. This one will play for hours and hours. Doesn't make
Yeah, there are a few guys.
Now I just got a.
That's the right side?
No, it doesn't look like that at all.
Sale website?
Yeah, there, that's it. This is it. All right, now go to lubricants. Over here somewhere. Or accessories, which
Really? It's on eBay?
it's hard to read upside down backwards.
Oh, really?
So I can even, I'll send you the thing if I think of it, but yeah, I'm saying $10.
Yeah,
I'll send it to you for free. How could you go wrong? You know, it makes crappy pictures, but this one makes worse pictures than that one.
I just bought some.
Those make reasonably good.
I wish I could tell you what a price was.
This I didn't really like to look.
That's it, right there. You're looking at it. Stop. Right there. What's the price?
Radio Club, you know.
Okay. That container is only 3 or 4 ounces, but you're only going to use a few drops.
It's fine.
And see how it has a thing? Mine lasted 10 years. I didn't use it up. And I used it on clocks. The reason a clock stops is there's friction on the bearings. And if you clean it first and then get the bearings lubricated, any clock will run again, even a 200-year-old clock, based on my experience. I just bought a grandfather clock up at Kutztown.
One of the radio ones.
No. This is 1810. Note works inside of it. I put one of their works in it. It has a wooden gear setup. Anyway, that's what I would recommend for you. You can use that to lubricate even, I don't know, a watch, but almost anything. And you can use WD-40. You spray it into a bottle. You let it drop the bottom, get rid of the water, and then you use the oil. We used it in cameras. I repaired a number of Exacta cameras. That's about the best oil you can find now. It tells you what's in the oil and how it works.
Are we done?
We're done.